The climb of Chapman's Peak is arguably one of the most beautiful sections of running anywhere in the world, and it is the iconic section of the Two Oceans Ultramarathon. But apart from its beauty, it's also the first place in the race where you begin to encounter some of the challenges that await in the second half. It precedes Constantia Neck, which is arguably the toughest climb, and so it's best to think of Chapman's as something of a curtain raiser. And so we're going to look at this section in two parts. We'll have a look at the ascent as you go up, and then specially look at the downhill, because I think that is where a lot of people lose their way by pushing a little bit too fast. The key word in this section, up and down, is patience. And so let's have a look at Chapman's Peak Drive and take you through some of the key things that you need to keep in mind on race day. So, this is the start of the climb, which comes just after the 29-kilometer mark of the race. At this point, you'll know whether you're having a good or a bad day, and so you can judge your effort reasonably accurately. What you don't want to do at this point, and this is really important, is get too carried away with the climb, because as I said, this is not the final climb of your race, and so you have to protect your legs as much as possible so that you're still strong for the pull up Constantia Neck, which happens in about 13 kilometers. The climb that you're on now is around 4.5 kilometers in length, but it goes up in two stages. What you're looking at right now is Little Chappies, which has a summit of sorts just after 30 kilometers. Then you actually descend for around 800 meters before climbing up again, this time for just under 3 k's before you reach the top of Chapman's Peak at around the 34-kilometer mark. The gradient here is moderate. You'll know you're working, but you should feel reasonably controlled at this point. That's 30 kilometers just gone on the left, and so you have 300 meters of climbing before you get some respite from the hill. If you want two keywords to tell yourself over and over at this point in the race, I think the two would be control and patience, because it's too early to do anything drastic, and so rather just enjoy these views of Nutuk to your left and save some energy for later on when you may need it. In terms of pacing, mentioned before that the climb starts just after 29 k's, which is more or less the true halfway point in the race. I know 28 k's is the distance halfway, but because of the difficulty of the second half, Chapman's, Constantia, and the last section up to UCT, it's around 29 k's that you can double your time to predict a finish, so keep that in mind as you pace yourself. This is the 800-meter descent that I spoke of earlier, and it's a good time to collect yourself, have a little bit of food to eat or maybe something to drink if you feel the need, and start to gather yourself for the climb up ahead. Don't charge down this hill because then you'll take a little bit too much out of your legs, but rather just go down at a comfortable pace and, as I say, collect yourself for what's up ahead. To your left, as you just saw, is a beautiful view of Long Beach, and ahead of you, where the road bends to the right as you see now, just before the 31k mark, is the start of the main part of the climb. If the wind is blowing, then you'll see at this point it's about to become a tailwind, which will help you up the early part of the climb. But again, at this stage, don't get too carried away. There's a long way to go yet, and just take things in a nice, controlled, comfortable manner. So I alluded earlier to the possibility that you may find yourself not feeling too great at this stage in the race. It's often deceptive and misleading because the first 30 kilometers are relatively flat and you can find yourself a good rhythm, which is suddenly challenged when the road starts to head up. The other problem is that you're in no man's land, that third quarter of the race, and science tells us that this third quarter is often the most challenging part of the race because you're halfway done but not yet close to home. The key now is just remain composed, trust the fact that you've done the hill work, you've done the long runs, and realistically, there's nothing that 31 kilometers of running can throw at you that you're not ready for. So just relax, take in the most incredible views to your left-hand side, and try to feed off the energy from the race. Remain positive through this section. If you look up, you'll see the road ahead of you winding its way towards the summit, but just stay in the moment, trust yourself, and don't get ahead just yet. It's just a bad patch and it will pass. On the other hand, if you're feeling strong at this point, remind yourself that this is not where the race is made. The elite race often splits on this part of the climb, but it's hardly ever the decisive move, and it's precisely because some of the runners get carried away here. Perhaps they're inspired by the incredible scenery, but try not to fall into the same trap as them. The road is about to get a little more challenging. As you leave this overhang and half tunnel, you'll hit the 32-kilometer mark, with about 2 kilometers to go to the summit. This also signals the start of what is the steepest part of the climb. It does get quite steep at points here, and it's very twisty, and so if the wind blows, it'll shift directions often. Again, composure and control are the buzzwords at this point. If you look up to your left, you'll see what looks like the summit, but don't be deceived, it's not. It's a false summit, and there are about 700 meters to go from that groove in the mountain. It's important here that you don't force the pace faster. You will slow down, and you'll notice it, but it is significantly steeper than the early slopes, so it's expected. And what you force now, you will pay for later. Because it's steeper here, this is also a really good place to implement a walk-run strategy if you feel the need. Now, whether to walk or run is always debatable among runners, but my recommendation here is that you'd rather choose to walk than be forced to walk. In other words, walk before you have to. So if you have doubts over whether you have it in you to handle the distance, and if you haven't been able to get in the volume or quality of training you wanted, then you will benefit from planned walking because it allows you to settle down, run a controlled race, and just delay that perception of incessant effort. This is that false summit that you saw earlier on the climb, and it's from here that you can see the real summit up ahead of you, around 600 or 700 meters away. This is where great support and the next aid stations are waiting to welcome you to the summit of Chapman's Peak. And speaking of aid stations, you will have access to water, coke, and Powerade all the way along the length of this climb, so make sure you take advantage of those opportunities. Drink to thirst and make sure that you replace the energy that you're using. Take one last look to your left-hand side here, just appreciate the breathtaking view, and then as you make this bend to the right, you will see the summit welcoming you. This is where you get to cash in on a nice long descent down into Hout Bay, an important descent, and that's what we will discuss in the next part of this series of recon videos.